Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Whiting, the Dean of the Graduate School of Design. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this exciting event. We're really pleased to have you all here. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Joint Center for Housing Studies, especially Chris Herbert and David Luberoff, for their help in organizing tonight's event. I'd also like to thank Liz Cohen and Shaun Donovan for joining us in what promises to be an engaging and dynamic discussion. So we're well into a busy semester of terrific events here at the GSD. I don't have time to reference all of them. Please look at our events page on the website. But I wanted to quickly highlight two upcoming events that I think might be of particular interest to this audience. On Tuesday, March 24th at 6:30 here in Piper, Michael Maltzin, who's designed a number of particularly innovative housing developments for the Los Angeles Skid Row Housing Trust, will deliver the Joint Center's annual Dunlop Lecture on addressing homelessness, what can and can't architecture do. Following his talk, Michael will be joined in conversation by Mike Alverdrez, former head of Skid Row Housing Trust, and Helen Leung, who's a co-executive director of LA Mas, which is a nonprofit that helps underserved communities shape their future through policy and architecture. And then on Friday, April 17th, starting at 1 p.m., also here in Piper, the Joint Center, along with the GSD's Department of Urban Planning and Design and the Logue Fellowship, are all co-sponsoring a half-day symposium titled In Pursuit of Equitable Development, Lessons from Washington, Detroit, and Boston. That event will feature presentations from people involved in projects in all three of these cities. A full list of the Joint Center events is available at a table near the first floor entrance of Piper and can be found on the Joint Center's website. So, I'm particularly excited by tonight's event, speaking both as a historian of this topic and period and as a designer and citizen who's deeply concerned about the future of our cities. I had the good fortune to overlap at a conference with tonight's star, Liz Cohen, as she was starting this project on Ed Logue and urban renewal, and it's humbling to see where she's taken that work in this interim. For those who haven't seen it, this is where she's taken it. In short, Saving America's Cities, which came out last fall and which examines the benefits and costs of the shifting strategies for rebuilding American cities after World War II, by following the career of urban redeveloper Edward Logue, who oversaw major urban renewal projects in New Haven, Boston, and New York State from the 1950s through the 1980s, is a fabulous book. And I recommend that everyone rush out, wait until the end of this event, please, to purchase a copy. I don't want to take any more time from her, so let me introduce her very briefly. Lizabeth Cohen is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History here at Harvard. From 2001 to 2018, she was the Dean of Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study. Recipient of numerous awards and honors, Liz also teaches a wide range of courses here at Harvard in 20th century US history, urban history, the built environment, and public history. After Liz gives a short presentation, sort of doing her best to give you a short version of what's in this dense book, Shaun Donovan and I will join her in conversation here at the front, and then at a certain point we'll open it up to question and answers, so you all should be paying attention and be prepared to ask really smart questions at the end of this. Please join me in welcoming Liz Cohen to the podium.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to Chris and David and the Joint Center for the opportunity to be part of this event tonight. The Joint Center has been extremely supportive of me and this project over the many years it has taken me to write this book. And that goes all the way back to when David Luberoff who's the deputy director of the center, was at the Rappaport Institute and the Taubman Center at the Kennedy School, and gave me my very first grant to support research for this project. As I say in the book's acknowledgments, the GSD has also been crucial to me. I'm an historian. I wasn't trained as an architect or a planner, and many faculty members here, a number of whom are in this room tonight, have really been crucial as my tutors. Sarah Whiting and Shaun Donovan, thank you so much for taking time from what I know are extremely busy schedules to be here tonight. I really appreciate it. And Sarah, I hope this is the one of many bridges that we will build between the GSD and arts and sciences here at Harvard. And to all of you here in the audience, thank you for coming. I tried very hard in writing this book to reach out to a diverse audience of readers, and so it's very meaningful for me to have an event like this here at the GSD. Okay. So I hope that I can give you a deep dive in a short period of time into the history of urban redevelopment after World War II, and that it can help us understand better how we got to where we are today, with a huge crisis in affordable housing and a crumbling urban infrastructure in many cities. And I think this history might even help us address some of those challenges. So I'm going to give you a short overview of the book and identify some key issues that I think remain relevant today. And then I look forward to Shaun and Sarah weighing in with their insights and the conversation that we will have together. I wrote this book because I wanted to understand better the changing physical environment of American cities after World War II. My previous work, you see the covers here, had probed the experiences of large groups of ordinary Americans. And for this book, the one, say, what became Saving America's Cities, I thought it made sense to follow the career of an individual with great influence in shaping post-war urban redevelopment. One of the reasons that this subject attracted me, was that I thought we had much too simplistic a picture of how post-World War II cities developed in response to the enormous competition that was coming from booming suburbs. We tended to reduce everything to a Manichaean struggle between a villainous Robert Moses and a more saint-like Jane Jacobs, with her message of anti-planning, hands-off, let neighborhoods and cities develop organically on their own. Surely, I thought, the story must be more complex than these two extremes. I certainly recognized that urban renewal from the late 1940s into the 1970s had some very serious flaws. Excessive demolition and dislocation of residents, highways that slashed through still viable neighborhoods, and misguided introduction of suburban-oriented schemes like shopping centers into downtowns. But I also knew that many cities were truly in deep trouble by the 1940s, after the Great Depression, the war, and starting in the late 1940s, the massive exit of people and capital to the suburbs. Finally, I was motivated to write this book by what I was seeing around me today: deteriorating urban infrastructure, a worsening affordable housing crisis, and a growing divide between those cities that are flourishing and those cities that are failing. I wondered, how did we get here? What had happened to the stated commitment in the Housing Act of 1949 to provide, and I quote, a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family, end quote. I quickly settled on my protagonist, Ed Logue, who had worked in New Haven in the 1950s, Boston in the 1960s, New York State in the 1970s, and the South Bronx in the 1980s. His long and varied career, I thought, would allow me to track shifts in strategy over time. And I was also pleased that he, and this is very important for an historian, he had left a huge cache of papers at his alma mater of Yale, including the transcripts of many interviews with him. And in time, I would discover that Logue's career in urban redevelopment tracked remarkably well with major shifts in approaches to redeveloping cities in the second half of the 20th century. So I'm going to frame Logue's career for you as a drama in 5 acts. And let me give you a quick summary. You'll have to read the book to get more detail. Logue grew up in Philadelphia, and you see him there on the left, one of 5 siblings of a widowed kindergarten teacher who had very few resources. He went to Yale College on scholarship and then Yale Law School on the GI Bill. Yale taught him as much about New Haven and politics as academics. He became deeply involved with the city and particularly with its working class residents, helping to organize Yale workers in their first labor union and training as a labor lawyer. He's actually wearing a union button there. He fought McCarthyism and discriminatory quotas at Yale, and he became actively engaged in civil rights. In short, Logue's commitment to renewing cities was very much a part of his liberal progressive politics, which runs counter to many assumptions that we often have that urban renewers were always part of a pro-business growth machine which put corporate profits over people. Logue thought the problems of American cities should be the next frontier of FDR's New Deal, and that extensive federal dollars and expert know-how should be applied to the challenge of saving America's cities. Another important influence on Logue was the time he spent in India during the early 1950s, working there for Ambassador Chester Bowles, who actually had been a New Dealer. He ran the Office of Price Administration for Roosevelt. Logue observed the U.S. government and the Ford Foundation organizing what was then called community development, making improvements in the physical infrastructure, building houses, wells, schools, and so forth, in hopes of creating a more equal, a more democratic, and remember, this is the Cold War, a more anti-communist India. Logue carried that message back with him into his work renewing American cities. And this was the first of many times that Logue participated in the transnational circulation of ideas about cities and architecture over his career. European social housing would be an important inspiration, as would the post-war new towns that were built all over Europe. And he would engage in that as himself in New York State. Act 2 is New Haven. This was Logue's first major job in renewing cities from 1954 to 1961. And here he teamed up with a newly elected Reform Democratic mayor, Richard C. Lee. New Haven was in big trouble. Factories were closing, good working class jobs were disappearing, and this was happening just when African Americans were arriving from the South in hopes of making a better living in the North. And at the same time, middle-class whites were leaving the city for the suburbs. And to make things even worse, I-95 was planned to bypass the city, which was a death knell to the city's position as the regional retail center of southwestern Connecticut. Logue and Lee felt that they had to do something. So they took advantage of newly available funds from the federal government in the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954 to make New Haven what they considered a national laboratory of urban renewal, physically as well as in terms of social programs. And so, for example, a program like Head Start, which became an important part of LBJ's Great Society, was actually tried out in New Haven. Lee and Logue had some notable successes, but overall, this first phase of federal urban renewal in the 1950s proved very problematic in New Haven and in many other cities, including here in Boston. Most egregiously, working within what were the federal requirements, important thing to remember, in New Haven and elsewhere, renewers tore down a poor but still viable low-income neighborhood to build luxury apartments to try to keep the middle class in the city and to create a connector to tie downtown to that new I-95. And they replaced much of downtown New Haven with a suburban-style, car-oriented shopping center. And you see the connector there, and you also can see the shopping center. I also probe how these early urban renewers went about involving community residents in the redevelopment process. Basically, they saw themselves as democratically minded experts, protecting the public good, and they sought input mostly from established interest groups and organizations. I call this approach pluralist democracy, a term I drew from Robert Dahl's classic study of urban renewal in New Haven, which was entitled Who Governs? Act 3, Boston. In 1960, Logue was recruited first as a consultant and then as the permanent head of a much expanded Boston Redevelopment Authority, known as the BRA, by another new mayor, this time a man named John Collins, who was committed to turning around his near bankrupt, physically deteriorating, and politically paralyzed city. Boston had had its own disastrous first phase of urban renewal when the immigrant West End neighborhood was leveled for middle-class housing. And that became Charles River Park. That's where, when you're driving on Starl Drive, you see the sign, if you lived here, you'd be home already. Logue came in promising to do things differently, waving a flag of planning with people, which remained his mantra throughout his career. I examined two major dimensions of Logue's Boston urban renewal work, downtown and the neighborhoods. In downtown, he used federal dollars and the physical presence of government offices to create a new government center, which you see here, to revitalize Boston's stagnant downtown, to create more jobs, and to pressure the Yankee business elite to start investing in Boston rather than everywhere else but Boston, which has been their way of operating. Here also, Logue came to recognize the importance of integrating historic buildings with modern ones, creating a mix that still characterizes Boston today. And you see the Sears block there on the left and Quincy Market there on the right. Then I look at 5 Boston neighborhoods. And in general, urban renewal there was much more contentious than it proved to be downtown. But I discovered that every neighborhood had its own story that could not be easily reduced to our common assumption that it's always about middle-class whites pushing lower-class blacks out of their neighborhoods. In fact, in Roxbury's Washington Park neighborhood, a black middle class welcomed the urban renewers with open arms, as they had very few options for where they could buy homes in Boston, and they desperately wanted the city's help revitalizing their neighborhood. I also argue that over Logue's Boston years, neighborhood residents learned to negotiate with city officials and vice versa. They ultimately would apply those skills to gaining more affordable housing than the BRA originally planned in many of these neighborhoods, and then, very importantly, defeating 2 major highway projects in the 1970s. Moreover, a very different conception of community engagement emerged during the 1960s. This is the North Harvard area of Allston, in case you're wondering. A very different form emerged than what I described in the 1950s as pluralist democracy. New expectations for what I call participatory democracy arose in city redevelopment, as well as in many other social movements of the 1960s, which required much more grassroots consultation and participation. Act 4 is here I just want to mention this picture. Ed Logue resigned from the BRA in the summer of 1967 to run unsuccessfully for mayor of Boston. And interestingly, this was his headquarters in a precinct that included Washington Park and Roxbury. And in a race that had 10 candidates, this was the only precinct he won outright. The payback from that neighborhood for the resources that they felt had been invested in the neighborhood. It wasn't clear what would be next for Logue until liberal Republican governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller, hired him to head a new experimental statewide urban renewal agency called the New York Urban Development Corporation. And that went by the name of the UDC. Rockefeller had become frustrated with the difficulty of getting New York State voters to pass the bond issues that were required by the state constitution to build much-needed subsidized housing. So the UDC was his ambitious workaround to be funded with a combination of state and federal funding, which was very much on the decline, and in a unique move, the sale of bonds to private investors. Rockefeller gave the UDC, in recognition of how hard a job this would be, enormous powers. And most controversially, that included the ability to override exclusionary local zoning, which he saw and still today functions as an enormous barrier to building affordable housing in suburban areas. And then Rockefeller rammed the UDC through the New York State legislature as a tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. after his assassination. And this was over the objections of many state legislators who were particularly opposed to the UDC meddling in local zoning. The UDC had many successes in its 6.5-year life. It built 33,000 units of housing all over the state. It sought alternatives to demolition-style urban renewal by building 3 new towns on undeveloped land. 2 of them were in upstate New York, and one of them is Roosevelt Island, which was built on Welfare Island in the East River of New York City. And the UDC deliberately planned these new towns to be mixed income, mixed race, and mixed age communities. The UDC experimented with innovative architectural design and technology, working with a list of major established as well as up-and-coming architects in the 1960s. And the UDC became a leader in affirmative action hiring in New York State. But the UDC came tumbling down when Logue tried to build modest amounts of subsidized housing in 9 well-off Westchester suburban communities, what he called a fair share housing program. And this is a public meeting in Bedford, and I think it gives you an idea of how well received his fair share housing program was. Logue had long tried to solve urban problems with metropolitan solutions. He tried in New Haven, he tried in Boston, and he thought that now, with his statewide authority at the UDC, he could pull it off. And boy, was he proved wrong. He met enormous pushback, including a severe reduction in the UDC's override powers. And that problem was compounded by another one, President Nixon's decision to impose a moratorium on all spending on housing as part of his new Federalist agenda to reduce the role of the federal government. The result was the total collapse of the UDC, which was accompanied by charges by bankers that the UDC had been putting its social mission before its responsibility to investors. Logue was forced to resign, which he did in great anger and frustration. And the final act takes Logue to the South Bronx. From 1978 to 1985, Logue served as president of a small, scrappy organization, the South Bronx Development Organization, known as the SBDO. And here he sought to rehabilitate himself after that spectacular failure of the UDC, which was, all over the newspapers, as he also worked to rehabilitate one of the poorest areas of the nation, with less power, fewer tools, and smaller amounts of funding than he had ever had at his disposal before. Nixon's cuts in appropriations continued under President Carter, and then they took an even bigger dive under Reagan. Between 1981 and 1987, federal housing programs were slashed by 2/3, more than any other part of Reagan's budget. The federal government was going out of the business of urban redevelopment and instead promoting private market solutions, the reality we mostly live with today. In the South Bronx, Logue sought ways of working within this new regime. His best-known project was Charlotte Gardens, which involved building 90 ranch-style, prefabricated, single-family homes constructed on the rubble of Charlotte Street. Houses were heavily subsidized for purchase with the goal of attracting lower middle class homeowners to stabilize this community. And then the idea was that multifamily rental housing and other kinds of programs would be expected to follow. To the surprise of many skeptics, Charlotte Gardens proved to be a huge success. With hundreds of Black and Puerto Rican Bronx residents, they were transit workers, security guards, police officers, firefighters, teachers, nurses, eager to buy the kind of home they either couldn't afford or felt were not available to them as people of color in New York's lily-white suburbs. And I think some points are worth stressing here about Logue's a final chapter here in his SBDO years. First of all, Logue regretfully, and this was very much the case, he regretted abandoning the previous prioritizing of innovative architectural design that he had invested so much in the UDC, in favor of very conventional styles that would appeal to prospective local buyers and private lenders in this regime of private market. Secondly, Charlotte Gardens and other SBDO housing provided a blueprint for the much more extensive 10-year Koch housing plan that followed. And that did add hundreds of thousands of units to New York City's housing stock. And third, and most notably, after paying lip service for many years to his mantra of planning with people, here in the South Bronx, Logue actually did it, working very closely with community planning boards and with neighborhood CDCs like the Mid-Bronx Desperados. You see Genevieve Brooks here at the bottom. She headed that. And the Mid-Bronx Desperados became his partner in Charlotte Gardens. And Logue did finally come to recognize how crucial they were to the project's success. So let me conclude this very short overview with some takeaways that I think we can get from the book that may be helpful in the discussion we will now engage in. First, I would argue that urban renewal was not the one huge, unchanging disaster of popular lore, with no lessons learned over time, but it was really a much more complex evolutionary response to American cities in crisis, where renewers like Logue experimented with different approaches as a result of their own admitted failures, as well as shifts in national policies and politics. Even if we acknowledge that urban renewal was the proverbial mixed bag, we can still aspire to recapture the spirit of commitment and experimentation, including in housing design and building technology, that propelled people like Logue. Rather, I think, than content ourselves with accepting the limited palette of possibilities that has come to dominate since the 1980s. Secondly, Logue long struggled over balancing the public planner's expertise with the role that residents must play in decisions that affect their own neighborhoods. Finding that balance still, I think, proves a challenge today. As community engagement has become a requirement, we now worry about how to avoid NIMBYism and too narrow a focus on one small corner of a city without being in a position to consider the city as a whole. Third, Logue, who was motivated by his own integrationist ideal, struggled throughout his career with how to create socially diverse communities that would be mixed by income, by race, and by age. He felt that this was the best insurance that low and moderate income Americans, who are often minorities, would gain access to the decent schools and other services that middle-class whites often demanded. But he struggled with how to do this. And still today, I think it's a challenge, even as we have more data on the benefits that children gain from living in socially mixed environments. And today, as we try to operate within a private sector-dependent environment, we worry about how to keep existing residents in gentrifying neighborhoods, how to provide sufficient numbers of Section 8 vouchers for low-income people who do want to move to better-served communities, and how to scale up the affordable units that developers are required to include or to help fund when they get approval for market-rate projects. Fourth, another hard cut for Logue to crack was how to involve whole metropolitan areas in solving the housing, the schooling, and other problems facing low-income city residents. After those failed efforts in New Haven and Boston, as I said, he hoped his statewide perch at the UDC would make it possible. But instead, it led to his and the UDC's downfall. And I think this difficulty remains with us. The Regional Plan Association of the Tri-State New York area, in its latest 4th regional plan, lamented the enormous inequities in the New York metropolitan area, but could provide no simple pathway to remedying it. And finally, Logue's greatest disappointment was a decline in the role and responsibility of government, particularly at the federal level, for financing the revitalization of cities and the subsidizing of affordable housing. Over his career, he watched federal subsidies steadily shrink and responsibility shift to the private sector, which he thought was a huge mistake. As he discovered in the UDC debacle, private investors, not surprisingly, prioritize profits. He anticipated what we too often encounter today, such as too limited funding available through programs that are dependent on private sector actors, such as the low-income tax credits that depend on the allocation of sufficient tax credits and corporate desire for tax shelters, Section 8 vouchers that depend on private landlords accepting them, opportunity zones that are difficult to monitor to ensure that public, not private, benefit comes from them, inadequate public funding for the maintenance and renovation of public housing, despite an enormous demand for it in most American cities, and the difficulty of incentivizing developers to build more affordable housing. Also, too often cities are forced to make deals with corporations like Amazon, classic case, that in the end cost them in future tax revenues, uncompensated burdens on public services, and races to the bottom with other cities, where in the end, all the competitors lose out. And finally, when the private sector doesn't see the opportunity for profits, too often much-needed civic projects go unaddressed. So I will stop here, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
I'm just getting mad.
I thought you were getting your book to write another chapter. So thank you. That was really terrific. That's one of the sheer pleasures of being at this university is hearing people like you, faculty like you, speak so well. Let me introduce our second guest of the evening. Shaun Donovan, to my right, has dedicated his life to public service, which I have to say in today's world is a very meaningful and I think really remarkable thing to be able to say about someone. So I thank you for that. He has tackled the biggest challenges facing New York City and the nation and has fought for people and communities too often left behind. To this end, he serves as a trustee of the Urban Institute and on the advisory board of Opportunity Insights, a Harvard-based entity that brings together scholars and practitioners to identify barriers to economic opportunity and develop scalable solutions that will help people and communities in the U.S. rise out of poverty and achieve better life outcomes. Can anyone else say that they do things like that every day? Previously, Shaun served in President Obama's cabinet from January 2009 to July 2014. He was the 15th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. You were the youngest HUD secretary, weren't you? Just say yes.
Until Julian Castro.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay. You paved the way. So where he led the fight against the nation's unprecedented foreclosure crisis. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Shaun received a trifecta of Harvard degrees, his undergraduate degree from Harvard College, followed by an MArch from the GSD and an MPA in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. I also learned that he met his future wife here in the Trays during career discovery, but solidified by her getting an MLA degree while he was getting his MArch. In addition, and maybe most significantly for everyone,
the Trays.
yeah. Another book to be written. In addition, earlier this month, Shaun filed paperwork to run for mayor of New York City in 2021. So, anyone who's a New York citizen, please vote for him. So there's a lot here, and we already were talking earlier and concluded that we could talk for hours and hours, and so I am going to be mindful of, at a point, stopping to open this for questions from the audience. There were three topics that I wanted to put on the table, and you actually came to many of them in your concluding topics there at the end, Liz. So the first is the question of scale, how big things can be built today, and ranging from the scale of something like Government Center to the new towns, and the sort of scale and ambition that we saw in the examples from Logue and that period. The second, housing, which I think is an ever critical crisis today. Certainly here, we all feel it in Boston and Cambridge. But the question of housing, so the role of the local and the federal, the question of inequities, the questions of funding, the questions of public and private investment. And then finally, the question of expertise. Logue was only 32 when he got his job in New Haven. And that's actually pretty astonishing. So, I mean, there's a question, you raised the question of expertise as a question of expertise of the planning expertise and then the public belief and the public investment in their personal experience. But I would say there's also a question of expertise that comes with time and thinking, be ever mindful of my job, of what it's like to be a student. I think there's the overwhelming question of expertise when it comes to any job in a city. I don't know, I assume you've thought this through, Shaun. At this point, if you want to get involved in cities, feeling that you have to be an expert about politics, an expert about federal policy, of local policy, of economics, of social issues, of legal issues, of material, formal, spatial issues. And so this question of expertise, I would actually like to be the first question that we put on the table. The expertise that you saw develop in Logue's career and transform, so the fact that he grew as a public planner, but also the expertise that you would wish upon the audience of students. And I turn to you first, but I think it's also incredibly relevant for you, Shaun.
Well, this issue is a very important one in the book. And during the New Haven years, Logue is very invested in developing what he considers really a new profession of a general administrator who has administrative skills and then calls on the expertise of people in more technical areas of professional work. And I look at how this develops, and he sees it as a kind of network of people who will move from city to city, working on that local level. And I then explore the implications that model, which to some extent, well, you kind of embody, Shaun, in all the degrees you have, but that model has implications for the status of the other professions. So, for example, I argue that planners actually lose out in this era of redevelopment. That many of the redevelopers who become the agencies that are to be the recipients of a lot of these federal dollars, many of them sort of displace the planners that had been functioning in many of these cities. And so they're very dismissive, for example, of the planners in New Haven. And when Logue comes to Boston, one of his requirements is that he oversees planning and redevelopment, so that he sees planning as just too much kind of fantasy and not enough grounded in what's possible. So planners lose out. I see architects benefiting from a lot of the work that gets created. And I interviewed I.M. Pei, and you'd see that in the book, because he gave me some very good quotes. He said that was where a lot of the work was, what SOM didn't get. That the urban renewal work was very important. And developers rise in their status. So this general administrator who has these and there were a lot of names for it, an urbanologist, there was no sort of standard vocabulary, was something that he was very invested in. And at that time, he didn't involve in that, where he felt that that urban administrator was going to, by definition, represent sort of the public good, as it usually was, negotiated with the private developer and others who would invest in cities. And that goes through, enormous changes, as I said, over the course of his career. And I think that I still think we have a dilemma around this issue of, where do we need expertise, and what's the relationship between expertise and the kind of knowledge that communities have and bring to the table. And I don't know that we're sort of out the other end on that. I do think that One of the arguments that Tom Campanella, a historian that some of you may know, has made about planners is actually that in their recognition of the problems with the planning profession, as they move towards advocacy planning and put the public in the driver's seat, they actually lost some of the authority that they had themselves. So I'll just stop with that intervention, and I want to hear what you think about this, Shaun.
So first of all, I just think it should be said that we are witnessing the kind of death of expertise in our federal government at this moment, and I think it's a cautionary tale that when we do react against expertise in too extreme a way, that we end up with something none of us should want. Having said that, I think one of the great lessons of the book is that while expertise is important, it's fundamental to ask whose interest is it serving, right? And I think so much of the problem in my mind that you point out well in the book with urban renewal is that you had a set, and I think you're right, that it wasn't just business interests, but you had a set of leaders. You had generally, I could say this is a white guy of privilege, white guys of privilege, right? Leading the planning, often seeing neighborhoods as kind of problems to be solved, cancers to be cured, as opposed to figuring out a structure where that expertise could be put in service of the vision of a neighborhood, right? And I think to go back to this duality, which I think we'll come back to a lot, which you started with, which is, the Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs smackdown that we always come back to in these debates, is that for me, the real kind of goal here is how to be ambitious and use expertise in service of a resident-driven vision. We shouldn't expect residents to be architects or planners, and yet we ought to figure out how to work with them to put the power of that expertise to work in their neighborhoods. And this is something, when we, after Sandy hit New York, I put together a huge competition, worldwide competition called Rebuild by Design, where we began with 6 months of designing the program and the questions that it was by getting into neighborhoods and asking those questions with architects and engineers and scientists and landscape art, but all really forming the ambition in service, the expertise in service of the local vision. And I think that's one of the great lessons we can learn in this transformation that you talk about is who gets to decide what those experts are working on and what they're working toward.
Can I say something about that speaks to your scale issue?
Yeah, but speak into the microphone.
Oh, sorry. I'm just so, right. That brings in the scale issue and echoes a lot of this discussion about expertise in neighborhoods. I think that one of the problems we have today is that we have, in our commitment to community engagement and involvement, we have a hard time thinking about how that operates beyond the neighborhood level. So that, we see it very closely tied to a very small piece of a city. So what happens when, as you were suggesting, we need to think on a larger scale? How do we engage people? And, we also know that, and this is the kind of that NIMBYism is often a complicated process where it does not necessarily represent every voice in a community. Research has shown it tends to be older, wealthier, whiter people who will attend those public meetings. But then how do you even scale that up to think about the city? So we're kind of, locked into the neighborhood level of this by the model we have of our commitment to neighborhood engagement.
So it seems that, that does get to then the question of expertise. what you say, I think, is even more daunting for a student to hear, because you think, okay, I mean, I can understand how I go and survey a group of residents in a neighborhood, and now you're asking me to cover the whole place. And I think one place where that's been answered has been through data and sort of complex data visualization. And I wonder if that's one place where that can start to address some of the questions of expertise that are put on the table. So that's one point. But then the other point is more simple, which is simply how would you recommend preparation for the kind of positions, the kind of expertise that we're talking about?
And Shaun, I mean, you worked in the Bloomberg administration, and then you're thinking about doing this yourself. I mean, when you do think on the level, this project you just described, on the level of the city, what thoughts do you have about how to balance that expertise with that community involvement?
So having been engaged in citywide and even regional planning processes, I think there are ways to do this that really do engage people. When Bloomberg was mayor, we really did the first comprehensive plan for the city that it had in 50 years, called Plan YC, that was primarily focused, but it took into account many. How do you dramatically cut carbon emissions while allowing the city to grow by 1 million people? And it became a blueprint for what a lot of cities around the country did. And there was a deep community engagement process. And I think with the right expertise, in how to visualize and engage people in what can be very complicated issues, there are emerging techniques. And it's actually been really exciting to see designers get engaged in learning. We did a lot of this in Rebuild by Design as well, where you develop an expertise in being able to bring, drawing tools, modeling tools that allow communities to start to, literally design their own communities. I would also say that one of the ways we approached this in Rebuild by Design was to think typologically. And what I mean by that is to say, we had a huge region that was hit by Sandy, and we started to think about the typologies that were there. There are hundreds of small townships and seaside communities in New Jersey and Long Island that were actually quite similar in terms of the types of approaches and could learn from each other. And so we actually picked a set of communities to allow those communities to begin to get engaged in a very specific local way, but then also brought together a much larger group of communities to be able to learn from each other. Even if we weren't going to be able to award every one of those communities, there was a kind of network and learning effect that happened through doing that. That's an example of how you start to think both locally and regionally at the same time. The only other thing I wanted to say on this, and this is quite personal for me, because having come to architecture school here, frankly been disillusioned by the lack of ambition about making cities better, about poverty, about many of the issues that frankly in the early 90s when I was here weren't in the forefront of what architects were thinking about. I ended up at the Kennedy School. But one of the things that I've always treasured about my architecture education is that the expertise in some ways that designers have is to imagine things that don't exist yet. And what I have found as a bureaucrat and as a public leader is that that's an enormously powerful expertise. We teach everywhere else in just about in the university and in our education system, we teach linear thinking. We don't think, or we don't teach both how to see and think about if you're going into a community where you don't want to just see it as a problem, you actually want to understand the assets, understand the people who live there and what their aspirations are. First, being able to see is a very important thing. And then being able to imagine and to design and to make those leaps. And that's really what I found I was using my design education for in government is designing new solutions. But when we brought together architects in Rebuild by Design and in other ways, the greatest power was to help people imagine things that they couldn't yet see. And I think that is an expertise we don't value enough in our society, but we teach here.
No, I think that's a hugely important point, because I think that the danger of expertise is that it becomes sort of associated with footnotes, let's say, with
And repetition.
and repetition and precedent, and sort of expertise is everything behind you that you sit upon and speak from. And I think you're right that the expertise of design is this idea of imagining a world that doesn't exist yet, and that ambition. And that runs through the book, especially when you get to the UDC. There's a question of sort of investing in ambition, a willingness to see this grand investment in a world that didn't exist yet. And I just don't know how to bring that back. I mean, other than electing you, which we'll all help do. I'm not really a New York voter, so I can say that as a joke. It's just being recorded, I think. But how do we bring that level of ambition back, and how do you bring that out of the Logue story?
Well, it's a really very, I think, important point. And, when you talked about the architect being able to help people visualize, I think that is true on a sort of, on one level. But there's just another whole level of imagining things, imagining possibilities that I really did see. It was one of the positive sides of this era, of people seeing problems and thinking that they could really come up with solutions. We've been critical here of some of the, defeatedness of it, or the distortion of it, or thinking you could solve problems that by your own that you really needed to engage more people with. But there still is something to admire, I think, about having that sense of we can experiment with this. So, for example, let me give you an example. One of the major design problems that the UDC took on was it was a time of tremendous criticism of high-rise public housing. So the idea was, how can we, in fact, preserve the same density, but do it through low-rise? And there was a very important prototype project in Brooklyn called Marcus Garvey Houses that Peter Eisenman and some other very important architects involved in it designed, with Ted Liebman as the head designer at the UDC. They were really very excited about thinking about an alternative. After that was accomplished, they then decided, maybe we should revisit the possibilities in high-rise public housing. Maybe, if we're building high towers for wealthy people in New York, maybe it's not so terrible. Maybe there actually are better possibilities. And right before the UDC went under, they structured a competition for Roosevelt Island to put up, over 1,000, a project to put up, it was for the northern end of the island, 1,000 units of mixed income housing that would be high-rise. In the end, it was, 4 winners, and nothing really came of it. But that feeling that we can take these things on and we can come up with new solutions is something I think we would benefit from revisiting.
It's funny you mentioned that. My first internship when I was a student at the GSD was with Ted Liebman at his firm, designing housing. My best friend growing up lived on Roosevelt Island in a Jose Luis Sert designed, really interesting approach to housing that really did move. Yeah, so there was an enormous amount of experimentation. I think just to go back to something I started to talk about before, I'm a big believer in ambition, and I do think it comes back to this question of who is that ambition in service of? Whose vision is it? And I think too often, to generalize, which I think your book does well to avoid, but let me do it here. Too often this was experimenting on neighborhoods, not with neighborhoods. And in that sense, it was done where, and I often try to begin with this in thinking about community development today, that too often there was a problem-based process. And what I mean by that is, as I said before, there's a cancer to be cured, there's a problem to be solved. The right way to approach ambitious community development processes, I think, is to begin in a totally different way, is to go into neighborhoods and say, what do you like about your neighborhood? What are the assets here? What's good about it that we are going to start and build from? And what are the opportunities that creates for the change that you want? And I think if you begin with that frame, you can be ambitious, but you can do it in a way that is in service of a local vision. Because the alternative, and unfortunately what happened, was that the grand visions of public housing, Corbusier, of Eisenman, of Richard Meyer did UDC, like there's a whole incredible range, of architects that worked on this. But the failures of particularly public housing led to a reaction that I think pushed architects and architecture out of the conversation. And when I was here, people didn't want to go do affordable housing, right? The sort of crowning moment of this was the moment in The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand's book, where Howard Rourke demolishes the Pruitt-Igoe, his own creation, right? And that was the answer, is that we ought to be tearing all these things down as opposed to thinking about what we build. And my hope is that we're now in a moment where architecture can reemerge as a force for good, but in service of a different good.
So housing. So you've carefully read the book. You've spent time thinking about housing, working on housing. That's pretty unusual for someone going into public office to have that as a topic under your belt and as a topic that's so critical today. Do you have ideas about how a big city, whether it be New York, whether it be Boston, whether it be any big city in the U.S. today, how it can approach the question of housing specifically?
None whatsoever, I'm sorry.
All right.
You really? The problem is we don't have enough time, but look, we are seeing the greatest affordable housing crisis, I think, of my lifetime and in a long time. And it's being driven, the book is Urban America in the Suburban Age. I think what we're witnessing is the urban age. We've moved out of the suburban age and into the urban age. And while it's true that there are still cities, Detroit and many others that I've worked in, that are struggling, by and large, what we're seeing is a movement back into the city. And to be a little provocative, I think we're witnessing the second great black migration, which is pushing black and brown people out of cities because of the rising affordability crisis. And so in some ways, in a strange sort of way, the goals of urban renewal were achieved in terms of the success of cities, not in the ways or with the outcomes that Logue would have envisioned, and in fact, many ways, as you said, against the goals that he would have envisioned. And I think the housing crisis that we're witnessing is really, it needs lots more federal resources, but it also needs fundamental rethinking about the way we rezone communities. There's some interesting experiments going on. California's been trying to, ironically, like the UDC did, to override local zoning. It's been a huge fight, but you do see strange bedfellows starting to come together, real estate industry and local activists saying the city of Minneapolis just abolished single-family zoning. Somebody who worked for me is now the housing commissioner in Minnesota and was celebrating that. So we do see in places that's starting to happen. And you see in the presidential campaign, housing, it's not getting a huge amount of airtime, but it's getting more airtime than it's gotten in a long time because it is really starting to bubble up as a crisis. our GDP as a country is lower than it would be because of the housing crisis, because people could no longer move to where the jobs are. Mobility is down it's the lowest on record in terms of people moving. And so in lots of different ways, this housing crisis is affecting the country in powerful ways, and we do need a much more aggressive strategy in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, well, that will certainly be challenging. There's so many, it's very good that you brought up how we're living in many cities, a Boston, a San Francisco, a Washington, D.C., in an era when, young tech workers in their 30s and empty nesters want to live in cities, and that is having an enormous impact through gentrification and so forth, as you pointed out. And making and pushing, and there's some very interesting and I think disturbing contradictions that are going on. It's rooting many low-income people even more, though, in their own neighborhoods, which are often not well-serviced communities. So we're, one of the problems that's happening is that, and it's even, I was going to say this even before you went in this direction, that, as we emphasize, you talked about going to a community and asking people, well, what is missing? What do you want in your community? The assumption that's underlying that is that people actually want to stay in that community. And with all the inequities we have in this society, where your zip code is dictating so much about the schools that your children go to, the opportunities that they have in the future, the transit accessibility you have, I don't know that the answer is keeping people in their little boxes. We do want to strive for socially mixed communities still, and it gets very difficult to do that. I mean, if we could, one response to gentrification would be to try to have ways of protecting the housing that people who are already there have, so they also benefit from the improvements that will come when middle-class people move into those communities. Those will be your challenges if you win in New York, and they're very tough ones.
So before we open it up to questions, I wanted to get to this question of scale. And I think that, there's partly a question of the examples that you show, whether it's the Chapel Street Mall, which already was a kind of big scale idea of shopping that was total failure in New Haven, but Government Center, Roosevelt Island, the new towns, essentially. There's a scale of development that you trace that's getting bigger and bigger. Today, I think the big scale issue is not necessarily a built program, but is the question of climate change in cities. And I wonder if you can draw, this is a little bit out of left field, but if you can draw from the ways that you saw moments that worked successfully in Logue's history, possibilities for working towards a problem like that.
Well, first, I want to just say something about this scale issue and housing, which is that, a lot of the ways we're trying to work within this private sector strategy today is to require that, developers have a certain number of units included in a market rate project. But that scale is never going to get us to solve the level of problem that we really have today. So we're forced in this area of housing, I think, to push to much larger scale projects if we're going to take it on. And, we have right here in the Boston area some interesting experiments underway, political experiments more than anything, where Newton is facing in this, a referendum in its election coming up, in another week or so, two big projects of affordable housing in, a community that is known to be, a very progressive one, but there is a tremendous resistance to those projects. And people, feel it. I just heard on the radio this morning, somebody saying, but the congestion that will come with traffic, if we have that large a scale, if we add those units of housing. So, we have a major problem, and we have in Massachusetts 40B. We mandate a supposedly certain percentage of housing that needs to be affordable, and it's still extremely difficult to do it. So, I don't have the answers, but we do have to figure out how to do this at scale and how to get people to see that it is in their interests. And I was at a panel. We asked you, actually, this was the panel at the Urban Institute that we, remember in October, had hoped that you might participate in. Instead, you're here tonight. We're grateful for that. But one of there was a speaker there from the Washington LISC office. And he had, I think, a very good response to this suburban pushback against building affordable housing. He said that he's been telling communities, if you like your cafes and you like your lovely restaurants and you like your retail, and we know retail is an enormous crisis in this country, even though every mixed-use project has retail on the bottom floor, tell me what retail is going to actually go in there. You want those things. You need to build to density, or you're never going to sustain them, particularly in this era when, as we say, when brick and mortar retail is suffering so badly. So, we have to find ways, I think, because we do need to build to that scale, how can we get people to recognize that it is ultimately in their interest? It did happen in Minneapolis, and that's pretty remarkable.
I think the Newton example is an interesting one to put on the table because it's actually a question of voting for the rezoning, but it has only coalesced in the public imagination around these two projects. And I think the issue of how one communicates changes in urban policy, changes in urban planning, and that it usually ends up being a hot button issue around a specific project as opposed to understanding the broader implications of what the rezoning would do. So I think that's an important question.
Yeah. And to build on that, this was my experience very much in New York, and then I saw it nationally when I went to HUD, that so much of getting whether it's a rezoning or redevelopment right is in comprehensive planning. At the end of the day, if the conversation goes to the parks, the schools, the transfer, if you've really thought through and can bring to the table, here are all the ways that the community benefits, in addition to having the conversation about the density, it doesn't make it easy. I've had to be protected by police at community board meetings plenty of times, but at the end of the day, I think you can build constituencies that overcome the NIMBYism if you do the politics, and I mean small p politics, right, by really having a conversation that brings all the elements into play rather than just a conversation about density. And it's why I think comprehensive planning is so important in neighborhoods, in cities, in metropolitan areas. I would also, I want to go back to your question, Sarah, about climate change, because I fundamentally agree that this is an area where ambition is not only, good, it is absolutely necessary. And we have to start thinking, very differently about the way we build. I think part of what we get wrong about this, though, and it's a little bit of my answer maybe to the inclusionary zoning question, that it's not big enough scale, is that we have to remember that cities are unbelievably dynamic, right? There are a million things changing all the time. And we tend to undersell the power of changing rules, doing the simple things that add up over time. And I always like to say, if you're really going to make a city more resilient to climate change, every single person that works in that city has to think about resiliency. Mm-hmm. Every time you plant a tree, every time you repave a sidewalk, every time you make any decision, you have to think about the consequences of climate change, because at the end of the day, if every sidewalk is actually more porous and allows, make sure that you don't have huge amounts of runoff that are polluted and flooding, that those are the types of things that actually can make an enormous difference. So we tend to focus on the Moses-like projects and not enough on the sort of totally unsexy but important day-to-day decisions that are made. And if you do those over a long enough period of time, if you do it in a comprehensive way, you actually can make a difference. And then I also think you need the Robert Moses, when we did Rebuilt by Design, Bjarke Ingels did something called the Big U that was designed to protect all of Lower Manhattan. And he described it as the love child of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. And I think that's actually a really powerful way to think about what ambition ought to be, right? It is a highly particularized, very specific set of different proposals that make up, in their totality, an enormous and hugely ambitious scale project. It will be built over many years. It's built with lots of different community organizations that were engaged for the different sections of it. But it is a way, I think, to approach this question of, too often we think in polarities, and I think this ambition and community engagement can happen together.
I just wanted to say one thing on the climate change. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying about the scale that it has to be sort of in everybody's daily lives and in the small things that people do. But I also think we're not going to solve this enormous crisis of our planet just operating at that level. But the obstacles are not just about policy of climate change. Sadly, I think it requires shifting the way people think about, on this one scale, the metropolitan area, which is, we pointed out earlier, I pointed out in the talk, is not the way we tend to think. You're not going to just solve it in all these different communities on their own. But even more importantly, we've got to get people to change the way they view government, because we're not going to take this. It's a national issue. It's an international issue. It's a planetary issue. And my book, Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, really does look at how the consumer mentality really changed people's relationship to government. And so the test became, for them, the same test that they had when they went to think about purchasing something. Am I getting my money's worth? And that mentality has led us to where we are today. That can't be the question. You can't think about it on that scale of your own self-interest.
I open the floor to questions. You were the first.
Wait, there's a mic
There are
coming.
microphones, yeah.
My name is Mike Seltz. I worked at UDC from 1969 to 1973, and I thought your book was absolutely right on. It was a superb account of Logue's use of federal resources, land write-down, mortgage interest, subsidy. But that's a bygone era, and the federal resources aren't there. Let's assume there's a Democratic president and a Republican Senate. What can the federal government do on a rule-making basis to deal with urban development and affordable housing? My question for Secretary Donovan.
Well,
Yes.
It's not a hypothetical question to me because I lived it, right? In the Obama administration, we started with a Democratic Congress and quickly ended up without one. I think we don't pay enough attention to it. It's not distant enough history now, but the Recovery Act, there were many things in the early months of the administration that made huge infusions into public housing, rail, a whole range of things that are important parts of an urban strategy. But look, I believe there is a significant amount that can be done by rule without getting Congress to go along. But I think there are two fundamental problems that more resources are absolutely necessary. I do think there are tools like the tax credit that we could debate. There's lots you could do, and there's a fair amount of bipartisan support for the tax credit. There are ways to do that. But I think we missed a huge opportunity doing tax reform to really restructure the priorities of the country, which is that We actually spend an enormous amount on housing at the federal level. We just spend the vast majority of it to basically help subsidize single-family homeowners to buy bigger houses. We don't even have a great policy to help people buy their first home because, without getting wonky about it, if you don't itemize your taxes, the mortgage interest deduction doesn't benefit you at all. And most of the people who are, vast majority, who want to become homeowners and are currently renters don't itemize on their taxes. And so there's no subsidy for them to buy a home. So, or little subsidy. So I think resources are absolutely important. And I think the other problem is that, unlike many other countries in the world, the Congress has gotten so involved in writing the details of federal programs that so much of the flexibility that might have once existed at some point, when I ran housing in New York, we had enormous flexibility within the law to tinker with programs and do other things. So I don't want to say there's nothing. We did a lot in the Obama administration to try to do that, but I think one of the problems we have as a country is that we've structured our federal programs in ways that we basically tend to keep legislating the same thing we had last year, as opposed to really being able to innovate in new ways. And it's one of the things I actually, when I look back at the powers that Washington had, the new laws that were being passed, the new programs that were being created, we've ossified federal government in a way that I think is not productive to really innovate and try new things.
I'm just happy you think we're going to have a Democratic president.
Venice Beach.
Bill Carlson, a real estate investor. People need jobs, and workers need housing. I counted, and in your entire presentation, I didn't hear the word jobs and commuting. Is that a mission, a fair representation of Logue's approach to planning?
Well, actually, jobs mattered hugely to him. I gave you a very quick summary of this book, but for example, the whole government center strategy was not only, obviously with construction project, but they expanded the number of people working downtown in that immediate area from 6,000 to 20,000. So jobs was always very important. The New Haven project, they were very focused on, and that this was a time when jobs were leaving the city and going into the suburbs. And a lot of the industrial infrastructure in many cities was very outdated, and people were building, they wanted big amounts of land to build sprawling plants, and they found that outside of cities. So cities were faced with trying to figure out how to keep industry within the city, not to go out to a 128 and many of the other options. I don't actually think that's a fair version of his approach. At the UDC was, one of the objectives for the UDC was actually as a jobs program, that Rockefeller was very interested in it as an employment problem. So, and one of the more interesting experiences I had talking about the book was I was invited by the Allied bricklayers and the bricklayers and Allied Craftsmen Workers Union, which was when I had its a big meeting out in Baltimore, and they invited me to speak. I had an op-ed in the New York Times in July where the headline was basically, where's Washington in the affordable housing crisis? And the head of the president of the union had seen that, and he also saw the commitment to infrastructure as jobs. And so he invited me to come and speak, and it was really extremely rewarding, and there were many, a lot of interest and a lot of good questions from the audience, but interestingly, they were not only interested in this history of and the crisis that we face today around affordable housing, not only interested in it as jobs, but also as places to live themselves. The jobs are in these major prosperous metropolitan areas, and many working people can't afford to live in those communities and not have commutes of 2 hours each way. So, it was I didn't expect that was going to be one of their interests.
you're going to have a chance at dinner. And so I'm going to just let a few other people first and come back to you, please.
Okay, yeah. Ms. Cohen, thank you very much for that presentation. It was wonderful. I haven't read the book, but I'm going to.
We'll go
And-
buy it.
And the positive way that you looked at the development going through with Logue and how it came out. I came here in 1967 as an architect and urban design background. And
Here meaning Boston or?
here meaning Cambridge, Boston, yeah. And one of the things that drove me or sort of was an action item was to stop the inner belt. It was sort of one of those efforts that we saw that was really a problem with urban design. And I'm wondering, what is the lesson that you might give us, not only students and us as a older group, of action items to go forward in trying to build the society that and the city that you talk about in the positive way towards the end of your presentation when you saw Logue trying to mix all these things together in a positive way, and you said it so beautifully. I can't repeat it, but I just
I wish I had all these answers, right? I'm an
we call
historian.
you-
I don't have to think about the future.
We call you lifelong learners, by the way.
You know, I mean, I think we've hit on both, you know, what some of the problems are and what some of the contradictions are, you know, in the discussion we're having. And I guess, you know, without prescribing, not getting down to that level of, you know, detail, I mean, I guess I would go back to that point about trying to think in a much more open-minded way than I think we are. We're just, you know, just the way you were saying, we tend to, you know, it's just the same program we did last year that we renew. So we're kind of just stuck in this paradigm of assuming that we have to try to make it work better within the limitations of what we have inherited today. And I think it's we're not going to get there that way. And even I was telling Rick Pizer here that next week I'm a little nervous about the speaking engagement that I am facing, which is that I'm going to be speaking to a Harvard alumni group in the area of real estate. And I realized that they're all going to be the private sector. And I don't know how they're going to take my message. But I was talking to Rick before about, you know, well, how I might package this in a way that might be palatable to them. Because basically they have to also get out of that paradigm of thinking that that's the answer. And it occurred to me that, you know, they too are saddled with the problems of trying to make the numbers work. And responding to cities that put more and more pressure to squeeze that affordable housing out of their projects. There was an article I think it was in the New York Times, that to build a unit of affordable housing in San Francisco costs $775,000 each. And some of the reason for that is the cost of the bureaucracy that is now involved. Or on the CDC level, the piecing together of all these little funds to get, you know, a project to come about. So, you know, there's a problem with this picture. We've got to think differently about how to go about it. And maybe I can get these developers to realize that, you know, that it's not necessarily in their interest to not have a more robust federal government that is invested in these in solving these problems.
I think one of the things that's so valuable about the way you tell the Logue story is that you do introduce nuance. You don't fall into the superficialities of A is bad, B is good. And I think the same is true with the developers. I think that understanding that how they're going to be advancing a possibility and possible ambitions, and how we need to bring them back to the table to work with the public good. So
Rick told me he thought about 50% of them would be interested in my, no?
No, I said 50%, you know, are true believers. The other 50 need to be
Okay, still 50-50.
Can I comment?
Really quickly, and then I'm going to give Chris the last question.
I want to be a little more optimistic about the potential here, because I think one of the things I saw, I worked with mayors all over the country, and part of what's happening in this sort of urban age of people moving back to the city, I think, in our old economy, basically you had raw materials, or you're on a river, or well located on railroads, and companies, mostly manufacturers, decided this was a good place to be, and they located there, and people had to follow. More and more in this economy, people are choosing where they want to live, at least those with the intellectual capital to be, demanded in tech jobs and other information economy jobs. And what's happening more and more is that companies and capital are following those people. And in an interesting way, what I thought I saw was that mayors who really understood this were less and less doing the Amazon thing of providing billions of dollars, and more focusing on design in the sense of how do we build cities where people want to come. And so we I think have a real renaissance of thinking about whether it's parks, and I've seen it in Birmingham, Alabama, where former steel mills have been turned into really interesting, beautiful parks where there's a whole kind of culture of walkability and other things that are happening in cities that have the power to really remake our cities in ways that are phenomenal. I think the big problem from my perspective is inclusion, like who gets to live there, and who does that truly public space belong to? And I think if government can sort of harness those trends, and I think the private sector is doing, you hear many more developers talking about walkability and LEED standards and all kinds of other things. But it's going to take government demanding and finding the tools to ensure that everybody's included in that vision. So I think, unlike what Logue was dealing with, where he was working completely against the market, there is the opportunity of a market force that is, people are moving back to cities, people are voting with their feet, but it has these potential negative consequences that I talked about earlier, that if we can't learn how to counteract, it will become an oasis for rich people. And you think an urban ghetto is bad? Try a rural or suburban ghetto. Look at the townships in South Africa. Look at the favelas in South America. It is, the alternative could be actually, another age of dealing with the kind of suburban problems that used to be urban problems.
Yeah.
You said you were ending on a sunny note. So you were getting there, and then you brought it down again at the end. Although for urban, I think it's good. I think I do want to end there, because I think that essentially you are pleading that everyone in this room really consider the importance of our engagement with the city. So whether you're our 10-year-old in the front row who just delights me in being here at all, or our lifelong learner behind him, I think that is really the imperative, that this story that we get through Logue, but also the optimism that we get with a generation that's willing to go into public service is really important. So I have to say, this really energized me. I'm super excited. I thank you all for being here, and we'll see you again in another event. Thank you.